A lady in the shadows of battle. When gunfire thundered across America, a quiet New England schoolteacher stepped into the smoke, defying every rule written for women of her time. The summer of 1862 burned across the American landscape like a fever. Fields once filled with the laughter of harvest now echoed with cannon fire and the cries of the wounded. The Civil War had torn the nation in half, not only by borders and beliefs, but by humanity itself. Amid the chaos, one woman, armed not with a rifle, but with a will of iron, would change what it meant to serve one's country. Her name was Clara Barton, a name that history would come to whisper with reverence, though in her own time, she was merely a lady out of place. The quiet teacher from Massachusetts. Born in 1821 in North Oxford, Massachusetts, Clarissa Harlow Barton was the youngest of 5. Her father, Captain Stephen Barton, filled her imagination with tales of battlefield valor from the Revolutionary War. Her mother taught her piety and duty, though Clara's sense of both would soon outgrow the quiet walls of New England propriety. Before the first cannon roared at Fort Sumter, Clara lived a simple life. She taught children in small classrooms, believing that education could lift even the poorest from despair. Her voice was soft, her manners reserved, yet beneath that calm exterior burned a restless need to help where help was denied. When war came, that fire found its purpose. When the world caught fire. In April 1861, the first wounded soldiers arrived in Washington, D.C. after the Baltimore riots. Clara, who was then working as a clerk at the U.S. Patent Office, one of the few women ever hired by the federal government, rushed to the railway station. What she found was beyond comprehension. Men bleeding on the station floors, their uniforms torn, their cries echoing in the iron rafters. She didn't hesitate. With their own money, she bought bandages, clothes, and food. She turned her small apartment into a supply depot, labeling every box by hand. When officials told her it wasn't a woman's place to deal with soldiers, she simply kept working. "I may be compelled to face danger, but never fear it," she wrote in her diary. By the end of that first year, thousands of letters from soldiers and their families poured in. They called her Miss Barton of Washington, a quiet helper, unseen, yet indispensable. But soon, Clara decided helping from afar was not enough. Into the smoke. In 1862, Clara petitioned the War Department for permission to bring medical supplies directly to the front lines. It was a request unheard of for a civilian woman. Men laughed at the idea. The battlefield was no place for ladies, yet somehow her persistence broke through bureaucracy. With a wagon load of bandages, coffee, and courage, Clara Barton rode toward the Battle of Cedar Mountain and into history. What she saw there would haunt her forever. Blood-soaked fields stretched for miles. The air reeked of gunpowder and pain. Clara worked beside exhausted surgeons, tearing strips from her own clothing to bandage men who had nothing left but a heartbeat. When a bullet tore through her sleeve, she didn't flinch. A poor fellow's head was lying on my arm when a shot passed between us. He never moved again. Word spread among the troops. An angel had come to the field.
The angel of the battlefield. From Antietam to Fredericksburg, from South Mountain to the wilderness, Clara Barton became a constant presence amid the carnage. She worked 18-hour days in heat, rain, and cannon fire. She nursed soldiers in makeshift tents, soothed them with cool water, wrote letters to their mothers, and sometimes closed their eyes when hope ran out. Unlike most nurses of the era, Clara had no official army position. She was independent, driven only by conviction and faith. Her wagons were stocked through donations and her own tireless organization. She slept on the ground, ate hardtack, and refused to leave until every wounded man had been found. At Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, her courage became legend. She arrived at midnight with 3 wagons of supplies, just as the surgeons ran out of bandages. "You are God's gift to the wounded," one doctor told her, and perhaps she was. Behind the lines, the hidden work. Clara's heroism did not end when the guns fell silent. After the war, tens of thousands of soldiers remained missing, their families desperate for word. President Lincoln himself asked for her help. She founded the Office of Missing Soldiers, a small Washington building stacked with letters, ledgers, and hope. Over 4 years, Clara and her volunteers answered more than 60,000 inquiries and helped identify over 22,000 missing men. It was slow, heartbreaking work, matching fragments of names, numbers, and faded handwriting. But to grieving families, she became the voice of closure. All the while she kept meticulous diaries, notes of exhaustion, despair, and faith. Those private writings, found long after her death, revealed a side of her few had known: her doubts, her loneliness, her deep struggle to reconcile compassion with the horror she witnessed. She wrote, "I lived among the wounded until I became one of them, not in flesh, but in spirit." Defying a world that tried to silence her. The world Clara lived in had little patience for women who stepped beyond their prescribed roles. Newspapers praised her courage but questioned her femininity. Government officials tried to sideline her once the war ended, yet she refused to fade quietly into domestic life. Instead, she traveled to Europe, where she witnessed the work of the International Red Cross during the Franco-Prussian War. It struck her like a revelation. Why should mercy know borders? Why should aid depend on politics? Returning home, she launched a relentless campaign to bring the Red Cross to the United States, writing, lecturing, and lobbying, until President Chester A. Arthur signed the treaty in 1882. The American Red Cross was born, and with it a new era of organized humanitarian relief. The woman who changed war. Clara Barton's story is not just about war, it's about the quiet revolution of compassion in a time of chaos. She redefined what it meant to serve, to lead, and to care. She proved that one woman, armed with conviction, could stand in the smoke of battle and bring light. Even in her final years, living alone in her Glen Echo home in Maryland, she never stopped working. Floods, fires, hurricanes, whenever disaster struck, Clara was there. Wearing the same worn bonnet that had braved Antietam smoke, her journals, the hidden diaries that historians later uncovered, show not a saint but a human being who carried the weight of war long after the battles ended. She once wrote, "I have lived my life standing in the gap, and if I have done some good, it was only because I could not bear to stand aside." Legacy of a Forgotten Fire. Clara Barton died in 1912 at the age of 90, her modest home filled with dusty papers, medals, and memories. But her spirit did not fade. Every time a Red Cross worker tends to the wounded, every time a nurse rushes into danger rather than away from it, her legacy breathes again. The woman who once stood in the shadows of battle had changed how the world sees courage. She showed that bravery is not the absence of fear, it is compassion in motion. Today, historians still study her letters and field reports, finding in them a rare mix of tenderness and steel. For SEO readers and history lovers alike, Clara Barton's life offers a timeless message. True heroism begins when empathy dares to act.
The angel of the battlefield is born. With nothing but courage, bandages, and borrowed wagons, Clara Barton brought mercy where men saw only chaos, and earned a name whispered by dying soldiers. The night before the Battle of Antietam, the fields of Maryland lay still under a pale moon. Farmers had fled, leaving their crops standing in ghostly rows. The air was thick with the scent of rain and gunpowder, the calm before a storm that would become the bloodiest single day in American history. Amid that uneasy stillness, a lone woman guided her mule-drawn wagons down a narrow dirt road. Inside were crates of bandages, lanterns, bread, and coffee. Her hands gripped the reins tightly. She was not a soldier, nor a nurse by training. She was a school teacher, and her name was Clara Barton. She did not come for glory. She came because no one else would. The making of an angel. Before the war, Clara Barton had lived a quiet life in Massachusetts, teaching school and working as one of the first women employed by the U.S. Patent Office. But when the Civil War erupted in 1861, the neat order of her world was shattered. She watched trainloads of wounded men pour into Washington after the Baltimore riots, lying on the station floors without medical care, bleeding into the dust. "I could not bear to stand and look on," she would later write. "So I went to work." At first, her help was small. She collected supplies, sewed bandages, wrote letters for soldiers who could no longer hold a pen. But the need grew beyond imagination. Bureaucrats dismissed her offers to send aid to the front, claiming that women did not belong in war zones. Yet Barton refused to accept that. Through persistence and sheer force of will, she won permission from the War Department to bring her relief wagons directly to the battlefield. That decision would change her life and the course of wartime humanitarian work forever. Antietam, baptism by fire. In September 1862, Clara followed the Army of the Potomac toward Sharpsburg, Maryland. The night before the battle, her caravan jolted over rutted roads as artillery thundered in the distance. When she arrived at dawn, chaos had already begun. Antietam was a nightmare made real, a patchwork of cornfields and fences turned into rivers of blood. By the end of the day, over 23,000 soldiers would be killed, wounded, or missing. The surgeons had run out of bandages by mid-morning. Men were tearing their shirts into strips to stanch the bleeding. And then, from the smoke, she appeared, small, composed, her dark dress smeared with dust, battling more than bullets. But heroism came at a price. Barton faced not only the perils of war, but also the sharp disapproval of society. Many male officers considered her presence improper. Some accused her of seeking fame. Others tried to have her removed from the field entirely. Even among women there was debate. Was she too bold, too direct, too unfeminine? Clara ignored them all. Her work was her defense. She lived by a single creed, that suffering should never be met with silence. Still, the toll was immense. Her health faltered. She collapsed more than once from exhaustion and fever. Her diaries, later discovered in her home in Glen Echo, revealed her private doubts. "There are nights when I am so tired I cannot think or pray. Only the cries of men remain." Yet even in despair, she returned to the front again and again. A turning point at Charleston. By 1863, Barton's reputation had reached both sides of the conflict. Even Confederate soldiers, it was said, respected the Lady in Gray who brought mercy without malice.
When Union troops besieged Charleston, she once crossed enemy lines to deliver supplies. Though the details remain debated by historians, accounts suggest that Confederate officers allowed her safe passage, a testament to her humanity in an age of hatred. One Union general wrote, "If there is any soul whose courage equals that of our bravest men, it is Miss Clara Barton. She goes where even the army dares not linger." The birth of organized humanity. When the war finally ended in 1865, Clara could have returned to private life, but she could not turn away from the suffering that followed. Tens of thousands of soldiers were missing, their families desperate for word. At President Lincoln's request, she opened the Office of Missing Soldiers, where she and her small team cataloged over 60,000 inquiries and identified more than 22,000 men. This was the beginning of something far greater, the birth of organized humanitarian aid in America. Though her title as Angel of the Battlefield had been earned in blood and smoke, her true legacy would be built in letters, ledgers, and quiet perseverance. She transformed compassion into structure, empathy into action. From the shadows to the Red Cross. After years of tireless work, Clara traveled to Europe for rest, and there she encountered the International Red Cross during the Franco-Prussian War. The organization's mission struck her heart: neutrality, humanity, service to all in need. It was the very thing she had been doing alone for years. When she returned to America, she carried that vision with her. By 1881, she founded the American Red Cross, persuading the U.S. government to recognize it under the Geneva Convention. For the first time, America had a permanent system of aid that could respond to both war and disaster. The woman who had once driven borrowed wagons through cannon smoke now stood at the head of a global movement. Legacy of an Angel. Clara Barton died in 1912 at the age of 90. In her lifetime, she had witnessed the worst of humanity and answered it with its best. Her nickname, Angel of the Battlefield, was no mere title. It was a reflection of how she had made men believe in mercy even when surrounded by death. Today, her legacy lives on wherever the Red Cross rushes to the scene of disaster. Every bandage unrolled, every hand extended to the suffering carries her invisible touch. In a world that still struggles with conflict, Clara Barton's story remains a beacon, a reminder that courage need not carry a weapon, and that compassion, once awakened, can march farther than any army.
Letters from the front, the diaries she never meant to share. Hidden pages reveal her midnight fears, her secret missions, and the unbearable burden of compassion in a world torn apart by war. The small leather-bound book was discovered decades after her death, its pages brittle, ink faded to brown. Tucked between reports, maps, and old letters, it lay forgotten in the attic of her Glen Echo home. When historians opened it, they expected the tidy record-keeping of Clara Barton's famous relief work. What they found instead was something far more human and haunting. Here were not the public words of the Angel of the Battlefield, but the private confessions of a woman who had carried a nation's suffering on her shoulders. The diary revealed the midnight doubts, secret journeys, and unspoken grief that had shaped one of America's most extraordinary lives. It was as if Clara Barton had written not for the world, but for the ghosts who followed her home. The ink of the unseen war. Washington, D.C., 1863. The capital was a city of chaos, soldiers limping through muddy streets, hospitals overflowing, supply wagons rumbling night and day. Clara Barton's official journals from that year read like military reports, lists of bandages distributed,
food rations sent, wounded accounted for. But in her hidden diary, she wrote differently. I hear the sound of guns in my sleep. Even in safety, I cannot rest. My hands tremble for the bandages I am not there to tie. The entries were brief, often written by candlelight after days of travel and exhaustion. They spoke of loneliness, not the kind born of isolation, but of moral solitude. Barton was admired publicly, but privately she was misunderstood, even ridiculed. Many officials still viewed her as an intruder in a man's world. Some accused her of meddling in army affairs. Yet in these hidden pages, she never expressed bitterness, only weariness. They say I am too forward for a woman, but I think they are too backward for men. Secret missions and silent burdens. The diaries describe journeys she never spoke of publicly, trips through enemy territory to deliver supplies to prisoners of war, nights spent hiding in barns as cannon fire shook the fields. Once, she rode alone through rain and darkness to deliver quinine to a fever camp where half the regiment lay dying. No orders were given to me, none were needed. I went because I could not stay. These secret missions, as later historians would call them, were acts of defiance as much as compassion. In an era when women were expected to remain behind walls of safety, Barton broke every rule. Her writings suggest she knew the cost. The road to mercy is lined with graves, and I must step between them. In one chilling entry, she described tending to a wounded Confederate soldier who clutched her hand and whispered, "You must hate me." Clara's reply was simple. "I hate the war, not the man it ruins." He died before dawn. That moment, she later confessed, haunted her more than any bullet ever could. The weight of every name. When the war ended in 1865, Clara thought she would finally rest. But peace brought a new torment: silence. Tens of thousands of soldiers were missing, their fates unknown. Families flooded her with letters begging for information. And so, at President Lincoln's request, she founded the Office of Missing Soldiers in a small boarding house in Washington. Her diaries from that time are filled not with battle, but with the weight of paperwork and the heavier weight of grief. Every name I write feels like a prayer unanswered. Every mother's letter I cannot satisfy feels like another battle lost. By lamplight, she and a few volunteers sorted through lists from hospitals, battlefields, and prison camps. Sometimes she recognized handwriting from men she had nursed months before. Sometimes she found only the faint scrawl of a dying soldier's note, "Tell my mother I thought of home." The emotional toll was immense. In one entry, she confessed, "I live now among the dead, and my dreams are filled with their faces. I wonder if this is what it means to survive, to be left behind to remember." Yet her persistence brought miracles. Between 1865 and 1869, Clara's office helped identify over 22,000 missing soldiers, offering closure to families who had lived in agony for years. Still, her private writings show that every success came with a shadow. For each name I find, there are 100 I cannot. The shadow of fame. By the late 1860s, Clara Barton had become a national icon, the angel of the battlefield. Newspapers called her a heroine. Politicians invited her to banquets. Poets wrote verses in her honor. Yet in her diaries, fame felt hollow. "They call me angel, but I know my wings are made of scars." Behind the public image lay exhaustion, illness, and the creeping melancholy. She suffered from insomnia, recurring nightmares, and the lingering effects of fever caught during her field work. Modern historians now believe she suffered from post-traumatic stress, a term not yet known in her day. Her writings describe sleepless nights haunted by the smell of gunpowder and the cries of the dying. I awaken and still hear the moans. The war is over, they tell me, but I do not believe them. At times she wondered if her compassion had become a kind of curse, a burden she could not set down. Yet, paradoxically, it was that very burden that drove her next great mission.
The Red Cross vision. In 1869, seeking rest, Clara traveled to Europe. There, she met representatives of the International Red Cross, founded in Switzerland after the Geneva Convention. Its mission? To bring aid to the wounded in wartime struck her like a divine echo of her own work. Her diary from that trip glows with renewed purpose. They have done what I dreamed could be done. Mercy organized. Compassion given structure. I must bring this home. Returning to the United States, she launched a tireless campaign to establish the American Red Cross. For years, she wrote letters, gave lectures, and lobbied politicians who dismissed her as an idealist. America does not need such an institution, they said. But Barton knew better. Disasters were not limited to battlefields. Finally, in 1881, her vision became reality. The American Red Cross was officially founded with Clara Barton as its first president. From the ashes of war, she had built a permanent army of compassion. Her private diary, however, offered a bittersweet reflection. I have given the world an organization, but I have given myself away. Whispers from the pages. When her hidden diaries were discovered in the 20th century, scholars were astonished by the raw humanity within them. They revealed not a saint, but a woman of fierce emotion, angry, tender, weary, unyielding. She wrote of her frustration with bureaucracy, her loneliness, and her disillusionment with the very government she served. Yet above all, she wrote of hope. If even one life breathes easier because I lived, it will be enough. The diaries also hinted at moments she never shared, the small kindnesses that history forgot. A lullaby sung to a dying boy. A bread smuggled into a Confederate camp. The way she stitched a soldier's torn Bible together so his mother would receive it whole.
Blood, bureaucracy, and the birth of a cause. From muddy camps to Washington's cold offices, Barton fought not only disease and death, but indifference to prove that humanity could be organized. The war had ended, but for Clara Barton, peace was nowhere to be found. The cannons had gone silent, yet the battlefields remained littered with the bones of the unburied and the cries of the forgotten. The soldiers had returned home, those who could, but the nation itself was bleeding in ways no medicine could heal. And in the midst of that quiet devastation, Clara Barton faced an enemy far more stubborn than gunfire: bureaucracy. The aftermath of mercy. In the spring of 1865, Washington, D.C. was a city suspended between triumph and grief. The Union had been preserved, but at a terrible price: over 600,000 lives lost, and thousands more still missing. Clara, the woman once called the angel of the battlefield, now walked among the ruins of paperwork, letters, and unanswered prayers. From a modest boarding house on 7th Street, she opened what would become the Office of Missing Soldiers, a place not of glory, but of record-keeping and heartbreak. Families sent her boxes of letters, photographs, and worn scraps of uniforms, pleading for word of lost sons and husbands. Clara and a few volunteers sorted them late into the night, by candlelight. I have seen the faces of the living dead. They come to my door not for food, but for answers, she wrote. Her mission was simple but immense, to trace every missing soldier of the Union Army and return their names to history. But what she faced instead was a labyrinth of red tape, misplaced reports, missing rosters, and the cold indifference of military offices tired of war. A paper war. If the battlefield had tested her courage, Washington tested her patience. Government clerks dismissed her efforts, generals questioned her authority, and politicians reduced her work to a sentimental pursuit. But Clara refused to be dismissed. She wrote thousands of letters to army quartermasters, state governors, and hospital administrators. She spoke before Congress pleading for funding, not for herself, but for the families whose grief had no grave to visit. When doors were closed, she found windows. When names were missing, she built her own databases, meticulous lists that matched hospital records to burial sites, camp ledgers, and personal letters. The paper mountains are as deadly as the real ones, she noted. Here, men disappear in ink rather than smoke. By 1868, through her sheer persistence, Clara's team had identified more than 22,000 missing soldiers. Her name was now known across America, not as a nurse, but as the woman who refused to let the fallen be forgotten. Yet, as she triumphed over bureaucracy, a deeper struggle brewed within her. The war had left invisible scars, exhaustion, sleeplessness, and what we now understand as post-traumatic stress. The weight of the ledger. Clara's diaries from this period, later discovered in her Glen Echo home, revealed a woman on the edge of collapse. She wrote, "I rise before dawn to answer the letters of mothers whose sons I cannot find. They call me a saint. I am only a clerk of sorrow." Her work consumed her completely. The government provided no salary, so she paid her own rent and postage. She slept little, often falling asleep at her desk. The same iron will that had carried her through Antietam now chained her to the endless grind of paperwork. By 1869, her health gave way. Friends urged her to rest, but rest was a luxury she did not believe she deserved. "How can I stop when so many cannot?" she said. Finally, her doctor intervened, warning that she would die if she did not leave Washington. Reluctantly, Clara agreed. She packed her notebooks, her correspondence, and the fragments of a country she had tried to stitch together, and sailed for Europe.
Europe and the revelation of the Red Cross. In Europe, she found a world recovering from its own wars. The Franco-Prussian conflict had left towns burned and families broken. There, for the first time, Clara heard of the International Red Cross, founded in Geneva just a few years earlier by Henri Dunant, a man who, like her, had been haunted by the cries of the wounded. The idea stunned her. Neutral humanitarian aid, protected by international law, ready to serve the wounded of all nations. It was what she had been doing alone, but now it had form, structure, and recognition. In her European journal, she wrote, "They have achieved what I only dreamed, to make mercy a system and compassion a law." She volunteered with the Red Cross during the Franco-Prussian War, coordinating relief for refugees and wounded soldiers in Strasbourg and Paris. The discipline and coordination impressed her deeply. No longer was mercy a scattered act of charity,
It was an institution, organized, impartial, enduring. She resolved to bring that same model home.
The return to resistance. When Clara returned to America in 1873, she carried a new mission, the establishment of the American Red Cross. But the country she came back to was weary of reformers. The Civil War was a painful memory people wanted to forget. Politicians dismissed her proposal as unnecessary. "We are at peace," they said. "There will be no more wars." Clara, who had seen the floods of the Mississippi and the fires of Chicago, knew better. Disaster, she told them, does not need war to make itself known. She began writing pamphlets, giving public lectures, and lobbying every president from Rutherford H. Hayes to Chester A. Arthur. For 8 long years, she faced indifference, mockery, and rejection. Yet she pressed on. If the heart of a nation can be moved by war, it can be moved by suffering, she wrote. We must learn to organize our compassion before the need arises. The birth of a cause. In 1881, her persistence finally bore fruit. President Chester A. Arthur, impressed by her tireless advocacy, signed the American Red Cross Charter. At 60 years old, Clara Barton became its first president. Her small headquarters on F Street in Washington was modest, just a handful of desks, maps, and volunteers, but it represented something revolutionary, the establishment of the American Red Cross. But the country she came back to was weary of reformers. The Civil War was a painful memory people wanted to forget. Politicians dismissed her proposal as unnecessary. "We are at peace," they said. "There will be no more wars." No longer would disaster relief depend solely on chance or charity. Under her leadership, the Red Cross responded to floods, forest fires, and famines, providing medical aid, food, and shelter wherever it was needed. For the first time in American history, compassion had a framework, a bureaucracy of mercy. The Red Cross, she declared, is not a monument to war, but a preparation for peace. It was, in every sense, the culmination of her life's work, proof that what she had begun in muddy camps and candlelit tents could outlive her. The Iron Angel in winter. But Clara Barton was never one to rest on triumph. She oversaw missions across the United States, organized disaster relief during the Johnstown flood of 1889, and led Red Cross teams during the Spanish-American War, even in her late 70s. She was seen unloading supply crates with her own hands. Behind the scenes, though, she still battled bureaucracy, now within her own creation. As the Red Cross grew, so did internal politics and power struggles. Clara, used to command by instinct rather than committee, clashed with younger administrators who wanted modernization and control. Her private letters from this time show a heart torn between pride and pain. "I fought to give this cause a body. Now I see it grow beyond me, and I must let it walk on its own." In 1904, at 83 years, she finally resigned as president. Her parting words were both humble and prophetic. "The work is not mine, nor was it ever. It is the world's, and it will go on." The legacy of organization and humanity. Clara Barton's later years were quiet, but not idle. She continued to advocate for prison reform, civil rights, and women's suffrage, believing that every act of mercy, however small, was part of a greater moral order. When she died in 1912, the flags of the Red Cross across America were lowered to half-mast. From the smoke of Antietam to the ledgers of Washington, she had proven one radical idea, that compassion could be systematized, that mercy could wear a uniform as surely as any soldier. Today, every Red Cross worker, every emergency responder who races toward chaos instead of away from it, carries the legacy of that belief.
From battlefield to Red Cross. The war ended, but her mission did not. Out of the ashes of the Civil War, she forged a symbol that would outlive every battle, the American Red Cross. The gunfire had stopped, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was the sound
of a country trying to remember how to live again. The smoke had drifted away from Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh, but for Clara Barton, the war was far from over. While others celebrated victory, she gathered her worn notebooks, bandages, and lists of the missing. Her work, the healing of a nation, had only just begun. It was 1865. Washington, D.C. was a city of broken men and unburied memories. Soldiers wandered the streets with empty sleeves and haunted eyes. Mothers crowded government offices, holding faded daguerreotypes of sons who never returned. The country had survived its own death, but now came the harder task, finding the lost and rebuilding compassion from the ruins. And in the heart of it all stood a woman with the resolve of an army. Clara Barton, the angel of the battlefield, now armed not with bullets or banners, but with pen and paper and an unshakable will. The Office of Missing Soldiers. Barton's tiny rented room on 7th Street became something extraordinary, a national hub of human hope. Letters flooded in from across the country. Have you seen Private John Thompson, 2nd Massachusetts Infantry? Or, please tell me if my husband, Captain William Hart, is among the wounded. The War Department had no answers, so Barton decided to find them herself. She opened what became the Office of Missing Soldiers, personally reading and cataloging every inquiry. Her desk overflowed with envelopes, ink stains, and sorrow. She and a few volunteers worked day and night to cross-check names, regiments, and burial sites, sometimes identifying dozens of soldiers in a single week. For every name returned to a mother, she wrote, a piece of the war's darkness lifted. Her efforts were monumental. Between 1865 and 1868, Clara Barton and her small team identified and recorded more than 22,000 missing Union soldiers, providing closure to families who had waited years for word. But her triumph came at a personal cost. Her health broke under the weight of grief, exhaustion, and bureaucratic indifference. Government officials dismissed her work as sentimental, unworthy of funding. The same Congress that had celebrated the end of war seemed unwilling to face the cost of compassion. Worn and near collapse, Clara finally agreed to rest, though rest for her meant simply finding a new battle to fight. A journey of renewal. In 1869, advised by doctors and friends, Barton sailed for Europe. What she thought would be a quiet sabbatical became a turning point in world history. Europe was aflame once again. The Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871, erupted across the continent, and Clara found herself unable to remain a bystander. When the city of Strasbourg was shelled, she joined a group of volunteers tending to the wounded. There, for the first time, she saw the symbol that would change her life, a red cross on a white field fluttering over makeshift hospitals. This was the International Red Cross, founded in 1863 by Swiss humanitarian Henry Dunant. Inspired by the carnage of the Battle of Solferino, Dunant had helped create a neutral organization dedicated to caring for the wounded of all nations, soldiers and civilians alike, protected under international law. To Clara, the sight was nothing short of a revelation. Here was the organized mercy she had long dreamed of, compassion made systematic. They have turned sympathy into structure. What I did by instinct, they have made into law.
The long fight for recognition. When Barton returned to the United States in 1873, she found a country eager to forget the horrors of war. "We are at peace," government officials told her. "Why should we prepare for suffering?" But Clara knew that war was not the only disaster that brought devastation. Floods, fires, epidemics, these too were battlegrounds where mercy was needed. She began a campaign to bring the Red Cross to America, writing pamphlets, delivering speeches, and personally lobbying every president she could reach. For nearly a decade, she faced rejection. Her proposals gathered dust in Washington offices. Many saw her as an idealist, out of step with a nation rebuilding itself through industry, not empathy. But Barton, who had seen entire regiments die for ideals, refused to yield. "If we cannot end suffering, then we must organize to meet it," she said. Her persistence finally paid off in 1881 when President James Garfield and later Chester A. Arthur gave their support. That year, Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross, becoming its first president. What began in a rented parlor with a handful of volunteers soon became a nationwide movement. Mercy in action. The early years of the American Red Cross tested Barton's leadership and the nation's conscience. America's first major Red Cross relief effort came not during war, but after the 1881 forest fires which destroyed entire towns. Clara and her volunteers organized food, clothing, and medical supplies, delivering aid faster than any government agency could. Then came the Johnstown flood of 1889, one of the deadliest natural disasters in U.S. history. When the South Fork Dam collapsed in Pennsylvania, killing over 2,200 people, Barton and her Red Cross team arrived within days. They built shelters, fed survivors, and even constructed temporary hospitals and homes. Newspapers hailed her as the Mother of Mercy, and the Red Cross became a symbol of hope in tragedy. The bravest deeds, she said, are often done without the sound of guns. But her humanitarian vision extended far beyond America's borders. During the Spanish-American War, she led Medcross missions to Cuba, aiding both soldiers and civilians suffering from wounds, disease, and famine. At nearly 80 years old, she personally supervised the delivery of food and medicine, defying tropical heat, poor transport, and political chaos. Her actions earned global respect. Yet behind the triumph, she faced the same struggle she always had: bureaucracy, politics, and resistance from those who could not understand her devotion to service above status. The human cost of leadership. Running a national organization was not the same as running a battlefield tent. The Red Cross grew quickly, and with it came administrative disputes, financial strain, and criticism. Some accused her of being autocratic, too independent, too unwilling to share control. Perhaps they were right. Clara had spent a lifetime fighting to be heard in a man's world. Leadership to her was survival. Her private writings from this period reveal a growing loneliness. "I have given all I have to give. The cause is greater than any name, even mine." By 1904, at the age of 83, Barton stepped down as president. She had founded something larger than herself, a living embodiment of her belief that humanity could be organized and compassion could be taught. She retired to her home in Glen Echo, Maryland, where she continued to write, teach, and advocate for women's rights. Even in her final years, she answered letters from young nurses and reformers, urging them to serve not for glory, but for goodness. The legacy that outlived the war. When Clara Barton died in 1912, the Red Cross was already a global institution, present in over 30 countries, its emblem recognized on battlefields and disaster zones around the world. From the blood-soaked fields of Antietam to the calm offices of Geneva, her journey had come full circle. What began as a one-woman crusade for the wounded had become a worldwide system of relief, a monument not of stone,
but of service. The Red Cross today responds to hurricanes, wildfires, earthquakes, and wars, guided by the same principles Clara once carried in her heart: neutrality, humanity, and courage in the face of chaos. "I may be compelled to face danger," she once said, "but never fear it so long as duty calls me." Clara Barton's duty called her across a lifetime, from the smoke of the Civil War to the dawn of international humanitarian law.
The last entry. What the hidden diaries revealed. Decades later, when her private journals resurfaced, they uncovered the untold cost of a woman's courage and how one heart changed the face of war forever. When the old house at Glen Echo, Maryland, was opened for cataloging in the 1940s, the air was thick with dust and memory. Volunteers from the Red Cross, sorting through stacks of faded letters and artifacts, found boxes labeled in a spidery hand, "Private, do not publish." Inside were hundreds of pages, diaries, field notes, and unsent letters belonging to Clara Barton, the legendary angel of the battlefield. For decades, history had painted her as a symbol of unshakable strength, a nurse who braved bullets and bureaucracy alike, founding the American Red Cross and redefining compassion as a public duty. But these journals told another story, one of doubt, exhaustion, loneliness, and an emotional courage few had ever glimpsed. They revealed not the saintly image America had come to love, but the human behind it, a woman who bled quietly for every man she saved, and who carried the war long after it ended. A discovery beneath the dust. Archivist Elizabeth Brown Pryor, one of the first historians to study the diaries, wrote later, "To open Clara's journals was to step into a mind at war with itself, brilliant, methodical, and endlessly burdened." The entry stretched from her early days as a schoolteacher in Massachusetts to her final years in Glen Echo. But it was the wartime notebooks, ink-stained and smoke-scented, that held the most haunting revelations. She had written them not for fame, but for survival, to make sense of the chaos around her. In one entry dated September 18, 1862, the morning after the Battle of Antietam, she wrote, "The ground is still slick with the night's sorrow. I have seen men whose faces will not leave me. I washed blood from a boy's hair and thought of my brother David. How strange that life and death can touch hands so easily." Historians had long celebrated Barton's courage at Antietam, how she rode through enemy fire to bring supplies, how a bullet tore through her sleeve as she cradled a wounded soldier. But the diaries revealed what the official reports never did, the fear behind the bravery. "I thought I would die there," she confessed in another passage, "not from fear of bullets, but from the weight of the eyes that looked to me for life." The silent years. After the Civil War, Barton's public image was one of tireless heroism. She founded the Office of Missing Soldiers, helped locate thousands of the dead, and later brought the Red Cross to American soil. But her journals told of the emotional wreckage that followed, the nights when victory felt hollow, and gratitude could not silence the ghosts. In an 1866 entry, she wrote, "I wake to the sound of drums that are not there. I see the rows of tents, the faces of the dying. The peace they speak of, I cannot find it." Modern psychologists would call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Barton called it the shadow that walks beside me. The same courage that had driven her through battlefields now demanded new wars against indifference, poverty, and bureaucratic cruelty. Yet she never felt she'd won. By the 1870s, she was a national figure, but an emotional exile. Friends described her as restless, consumed, and haunted by her own mission.
Her diary from that period shows flashes of despair. I have given the best years of my life to others, and yet I am alone. They call me angel, but angels do not sleep on borrowed pillows. These words, never meant for publication, strip away the heroic myth to reveal the quiet agony of a woman who carried an entire nation's grief on her shoulders. The weight of the Red Cross. Her later journals, written between 1881 and 1904, during her presidency of the American Red Cross, read like a chronicle of moral endurance. On the surface, these were her golden years, leading disaster relief during floods, fires, and wars. But behind the headlines, the journals show her frustration with bureaucracy, politics, and betrayal within her own ranks. She wrote of being undermined by men who could not accept female authority. They smile and praise, and then sign papers that undo what I build. To be a woman in charge is to fight with invisible hands. Her faith in humanity never faltered, but her trust in institutions did. One heartbreaking entry from 1899, written after a heated dispute with Red Cross officials, reads, "I founded this work to serve the suffering. Now it serves rules and committees. I cannot breathe beneath the weight of it." And yet, even in her disillusionment, her compassion remained relentless. During the Spanish-American War, when others saw glory, Clara saw only more faces to save. Her journal from Cuba describes sweltering hospitals filled with fever and despair. "I walk between the beds, fan the dying, and tell them they are not forgotten. They look at me as if I could promise them more than medicine, as if I could promise peace."
These moments, preserved in shaky handwriting, reveal a soul both indestructible and unbearably fragile, a woman whose mercy had no end, but whose heart was breaking from the very compassion that defined her. The secret of the lost pages. Among the most startling discoveries was a small, leather-bound book labeled only Private, 1871. Inside were several pages that had been deliberately torn out, later found tucked behind another volume. These lost pages, as historians now call them, contain one of Barton's most personal confessions. "They call me brave. I am only tired. I have seen too much of men unmade and women left behind. The world does not need more heroes. It needs more healers." That single line reshaped how historians understood her. Clara Barton was not simply a battlefield nurse, she was a philosopher of compassion, someone who saw mercy as civilization's highest calling. She wrote of dreaming that one day nations would prepare for peace as they did for war, an idea that would later influence the Geneva Conventions and humanitarian law itself. To organize kindness is to disarm cruelty. These words, buried in a private notebook, would become the unwritten creed of the Red Cross, an institution that continues to embody her belief that humanity can be disciplined into action. A final reflection. The last diary entry, dated April 9, 1911, less than a year before her death, is almost unbearably poignant. Her handwriting is unsteady, her thoughts drifting between memory and eternity. "I wonder if they will remember that I tried, not to win, but to heal. The world has changed its weapons, but not its wounds. Perhaps mercy is the only lasting victory." She died quietly the next spring, in the same house where those diaries would later be found. The Red Cross flags flew at half-mast across the nation. But the rediscovery of her writings decades later transformed her legacy once again. Clara Barton was no longer just the angel of the battlefield. She became a mirror through which America could see the cost of courage, the price of compassion, and the loneliness of those who healed the world. The legacy of her words.
Today, the Clara Barton National Historic Site in Glen Echo preserves her journals, letters, and artifacts, not as relics, but as reminders. Visitors who read her words often come away with tears because they realize that behind the Red Cross symbol and heroic portraits stood a woman who felt everything deeply and gave everything willingly. Her private thoughts, once hidden in boxes, now stand as a testament to the emotional endurance of service. They teach that heroism is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Not glory, but grace under suffering. Every emergency responder, every nurse, every volunteer who rushes toward disaster carries a spark of her conviction that even in the darkest hour, one heart can organize hope. The diaries are her final gift, wrote one historian. They show us that compassion is not born from strength, but from the courage to feel deeply in a world that does not. And so the woman who once stitched wounds beneath cannon fire continues to heal through her words. Her last entry may have ended with a trembling hand, but her story still writes itself every time a Red Cross banner rises over a world in need.